On a cold morning in the countryside, a wounded and silent dog waited at an auction forgotten by everyone. Everything changes when a child approaches and offers their only coin in exchange for that discredited animal. This simple gesture triggers a chain of events that uncovers hidden and dangerous secrets, and what was merely an act of compassion turns into an accusation that shakes the structures of power. Chapter 1. The fog descended heavily over Aspen Creek that November morning, wrapping the mountains in a white shroud that seemed to erase the world's edges. The biting cold of the high country penetrated to the bone, making people hurry through the town's narrow streets, huddled inside thick coats and woolen scarves. It was one of those days when winter showed its strength, transforming the landscape into something melancholic and beautiful at the same time, as if nature was suspended between life and oblivion. High up on a dirt road far from the tourist center, where visitors enjoyed hot chocolate, by crackling fireplaces, an old barn stood solitary against the grey sky. The dark wooden structure showed the signs of time, with loose planks, a roof stained by rain, and windows fogged by an accumulation of dust. There, far from the eyes of the elegant town, something was happening that many preferred not to see. An auction, not of objects or land, but of lives, animals that, for one reason or another, were no longer useful, discarded, forgotten, sold for next to nothing. Inside the barn, the smell of hay mixed with rust permeated the air. Small, makeshift pens occupied, the corners each housing a different animal: old horses, large dogs, a few frightened cats. Men and women circulated through the narrow aisles, observing with cold, calculating eyes, assessing prices, discussing advantages. Most were looking for working animals: a horse to haul firewood, a dog to guard a remote property. Few showed any kind of affection or consideration. For most people there, this was just a transaction. The auctioneer, a middle-aged man with a hoarse voice and a worn leather hat, announced the lots with exaggerated enthusiasm, as if he were selling treasures. But everyone knew the truth. These animals were worth little. They were leftovers, scraps, and the atmosphere of the place reflected that. There was a coldness that went beyond the temperature, a hardness that could be felt in the air. In the farthest corner of the barn, hidden by shadows and general disinterest, one pen remained practically ignored. Behind rusty, cobweb-covered bars, a large dog lay motionless. Its robust body bore the marks of time and past battles. The dark coat was worn, with patches of fur missing in some areas, and old scars crisscrossed its legs and flank. Its eyes, once bright and alert, now seemed empty, lost somewhere distant that only it knew. It was a German shepherd, or had been in another life. Its movements were stiff, as if each step cost an effort. Anyone who got close could see the rigidity in its shoulders, the careful way it distributed weight on its hind legs. There was something military in its posture, even in defeat, even forgotten. Some of the men who passed by knew who it had been, or at least they imagined. There were quiet whispers of a police K9, injured in the line of duty, retired after a serious incident that no one discussed openly. They said it had been too efficient, that it had seen things it shouldn't have, that its retirement wasn't an honor, but a disposal. Above the pen, hanging from a thin wire, a small handwritten sign said only, "Adult dog, $1. It was the symbolic price for which it would be sold. Below, in smaller, hurried letters, someone had added, "Does not respond to commands." Unpredictable. The warning was clear. No one wanted trouble, and no one came near. The dog seemed indifferent to everything. It didn't move when someone passed. It didn't lift its head. It showed no interest or hope. It just existed there in that dark corner, as if waiting for the end, as if it had already given up. As the auction continued its monotonous course, with low bids and quick deals, the barn door opened again, letting in a gust of cold air and two figures who contrasted completely with the rough surroundings. A well-dressed woman in a beige wool coat and a carefully arranged scarf entered, holding tightly to the hand of a little girl. The girl was 6 at most, with dark hair in 2 braids and large eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the place. Rebecca Sterling was well known in Aspen Creek. A career detective respected for her seriousness and competence, She carried a presence that made people move when she entered a room. But on that day, she wasn't there on duty. She was there as a mother, and she didn't want to be. Her face showed discomfort, her lips pressed into a thin line as she surveyed her surroundings. This was no place for a child, no place for her daughter. Clara, however, seemed completely oblivious to the heavy atmosphere of the barn. Her curious eyes followed every movement, every animal, every person. There was no fear in her, only an intense and genuine curiosity that made her pull her mother by the hand, wanting to see more, to know more. Rebecca sighed, holding her daughter's hand tighter. This visit had been Clara's idea. The girl had heard about the auction at school and insisted on coming. Rebecca had tried to dissuade her in every possible way, but Clara had a stubbornness that was not easily broken. The truth was that Clara Sterling was not an ordinary child, not just because she was the only daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the region, though that was rarely mentioned. Her father, Edward Sterling, was an influential businessman, owner of a chain of hotels that spread across the mountain states. The family lived in a secluded mansion in the mountains, overlooking the valley and surrounded by impeccable gardens. But despite all the comfort and privilege, Clara was growing up differently from other children of her standing. She wasn't interested in expensive toys or lavish parties. What fascinated her were stories of abandoned animals, of injustices, of people who needed help. From a young age, she showed an unusual empathy, a sensitivity that worried and moved her parents in equal measure. Rebecca watched her daughter walk down the narrow aisle of the barn, her steps small but firm, and felt a tightness in her chest. Clara was so pure, so genuine, and the world around them was so harsh. How could she protect her without suffocating the light she carried? How could she teach her about reality without destroying her kindness? Rebecca's thoughts were interrupted when Clara stopped abruptly. The girl had reached the pen in the back, the one everyone avoided. Rebecca hurried to catch up, ready to pull her away, but stopped when she saw the scene before her. Clara was standing completely still, staring intently into the dark cage. And inside, for the first time in a long time, the dog had lifted its head. Its eyes, once empty and distant, were now fixed on the girl with an intensity that was almost unnerving. There was no aggression in that gaze, no threat. There was something different, something Rebecca couldn't name. The barn around them seemed to have disappeared. The noise of the voices, the auctioneer's announcements, the footsteps on the wooden planks all had faded into a distant murmur. There was only that moment. That child and that dog, separated by rusty bars, but connected by something that transcended logic. Clara moved closer, her small fingers closing around the cold bars. The dog didn't move. It just kept watching, its breathing heavy and slow, its eyes fixed. Rebecca held her daughter's arm, ready to pull her away at any sign of danger, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was a mother's instinct. Perhaps it was her experience as a detective, used to reading signs and behaviors. But she felt, in that moment, that there was no danger there. The girl knelt in the damp straw that covered the floor, soiling her clean coat, and reached her hand between the bars. Rebecca almost screamed, almost yanked her back, but the words died in her throat when she saw the dog slowly lean its body forward. The movement was careful, almost reverent. It brought its head to the bars, and with a delicacy impressive for an animal of its size, touched its muzzle to Clara's outstretched hand. The girl smiled, a genuine smile full of a pure joy that lit up her face. And for the first time in a long time, something shifted in the dog's eyes. It wasn't quite hope, not yet. But it was something, a small spark, a recognition, a distant memory that kindness had once existed in the world. Rebecca felt her eyes burn. She didn't know why the scene affected her so much, maybe because she saw in the dog's reaction something she herself sometimes felt. The weight of having served, of having given her all, and still being discarded when it was no longer convenient. She knew that feeling. The police force was like, "Tevest, you gave years of your life, risked everything, and in the end you were just a number, a file, a forced retirement." Clara began to speak softly to the dog, words that Rebecca couldn't quite hear, but the tone was sweet, comforting. The girl seemed to have no fear at all, and the dog surprisingly responded, not with sudden movements or growls, but with total attention, as if every word spoken by that child was the most important thing in the world. The interaction drew attention. A few men stopped their bargaining to watch. The auctioneer paused mid-announcement. There was something unusual about the scene. A well-dressed child, clearly from a wealthy family, kneeling in the dirty straw, talking to a dog that everyone considered dangerous and useless. It didn't make sense. And people like things that make sense. A man in dirty overalls approached, spitting on the ground before speaking in a drawl. "That animal ain't good for nothing, little lady. Better get away before he bites you." Clara didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the dog. The man shrugged and walked away, muttering something about spoiled kids. But Rebecca saw something in her. Daughter's eyes. Determination. The same determination she herself carried when she decided to investigate a difficult case, when she decided not to give up even when everyone said it was impossible. Clara had inherited that from her, that quiet stubbornness that couldn't be broken by words or threats. The girl reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. A coin. Rebecca recognized it. It was a $1 coin she herself had given Clara to buy chocolate in the town square. The girl had kept that coin as if it were a treasure, refusing to spend it because she said it was special. And now there, in that unlikely place, Clara held the coin out toward the auctioneer, who was approaching with curiosity. "I want to buy him," the girl said in a firm voice, pointing to the dog. "The sign says $1. I have it here." The silence that followed was heavy. A few men laughed, the harsh sound echoing through the barn. Others just watched with expressions ranging from pity to disapproval. The auctioneer scratched his head, clearly unsure how to react. This was not common at all. Rebecca approached her daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Clara, we need to talk about this." The girl turned her face to her mother, and Rebecca saw tears forming in those large eyes. They weren't tears of a tantrum or a whim. They were genuine tears. The girl was emotional. "He needs me, Mom. I know he does." And there, in that impossible moment, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She looked at the dog in the cage, saw the way it watched Clara, saw the rigid but not aggressive posture, saw the scars that told stories that would probably never be fully known. And she also saw something that touched her deeply. Recognition. The dog was watching her now, and in its eyes was something Rebecca knew well. Loyalty. Even after everything, even after being discarded and forgotten, that animal still carried loyalty. She took a deep breath and turned to the auctioneer. "How much for the paperwork and his transport?" The man blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected that. "Well, there's the administrative fee, the transfer certificate, and you'll need to sign some papers assuming liability. The dog has a history as a police K9, so there's bureaucracy involved, all in. All about $500. Rebecca nodded and pulled out her wallet. Clara held the coin tighter, looking at her mother with gratitude in her eyes. "But is my offer still good, Mom? Can I give my coin?" Rebecca smiled, for the first time since she had entered that place. "Yes, you can, my darling. Your coin is the most important one of all." The auctioneer accepted the symbolic coin, albeit with a confused expression, while Rebecca completed the payment. The activity attracted more attention. People began to gather, curious. Who was this woman? Why was she taking that dog? Someone pulled out a phone and started filming. The scene was too unusual not to be recorded. While the papers were being filled out, Clara went back to the cage. "I'm going to call you Thor," she said softly, "like the god of thunder, because you're strong and brave." The dog tilted its head slightly as if listening, as if it understood. And maybe it did. Animals have a perception that goes beyond words. When they finally opened the cage, everyone instinctively backed away. The dog was large, imposing, and its scars reminded everyone that it had been trained for combat. But Thor didn't move aggressively. He came out slowly, carefully, and walked directly to Clara. The girl held out her hand, and the dog touched its muzzle to it again, its eyes closing for a brief moment. Rebecca watched the scene with a mix of emotions. Part of her was still uncertain, part of her worried about what she had just done, but another part, perhaps the deepest and truest part, knew that this was right, that something bigger was happening here, something she didn't fully understand but that she felt in her heart. Their exit from the barn was accompanied by curious stares and whispers. Some men shook their heads in disapproval, others seemed touched. The teenager who had filmed the scene was already typing furiously on his phone, probably sharing the video on social media. Rebecca knew it would spread. Aspen Creek was a small town and news traveled fast. Thor followed Clara to the car, his steps careful but firm. When Rebecca opened the back door, the dog hesitated for a moment. It seemed to be assessing the situation, remembering other lives, other moments. But then Clara got in first, sitting on the seat and patting the spot beside her. "Come on, Thor, we're going home." And he did. He climbed into the car carefully, his large paws finding purchase on the upholstery, and settled down next to the girl. Clara immediately put her arm around him, resting her head on his worn fur. Thor remained still, but his breathing calmed. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. Rebecca started the car and began to drive down the winding road that descended the mountain. The fog still covered everything, making visibility difficult, but she knew this road by heart. As she drove, her thoughts wandered. What would Edward say when they arrived home with a dog of that size? Her husband was a practical, calculating man, always thinking about consequences and responsibilities. He wasn't going to like this. But Rebecca knew that, in the end, he would give in. Edward loved Clara more than anything, and if his daughter wanted this dog, he would find a way to accept it. In the rearview mirror, Rebecca watched Clara and Thor. The girl was talking softly to the animal, telling him about the house, the garden, the rooms. Thor just listened, his eyes fixed, on her with an intensity that was almost moving. It was as if he had found a purpose again, as if after being lost for so long, he finally had a reason to go on. The Sterling mansion stood on a hilltop, surrounded by pine trees and carefully planned gardens. It was a modern structure, with large glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the valley. When Rebecca parked in the garage, Edward was already at the door, his arms crossed and a worried expression on his face. He had received a text from her saying she was bringing home a surprise, but he clearly hadn't expected this. Clara jumped out of the car, pulling Thor by the makeshift leash someone at the barn had put on him. "Daddy, this is Thor. He's going to live with us now." Edward looked at the dog, then at his wife, and his expression went through several stages of confusion. "Rebecca, can we talk?" The two stepped aside, while Clara took Thor to explore the garden. The conversation was brief, but intense. Rebecca explained everything. The auction, the connection between Clara and the dog, the coin, the decision. Edward listened in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes following his daughter's movements in the garden. When Rebecca finished, he sighed heavily. "You know this could be dangerous. He's a combat dog." Rebecca shook her head. "I know how to read animal behavior, Edward. I spent years dealing with working dogs on the force. This dog isn't aggressive. He's broken, but he's not violent. And you saw Clara. When was the last time you saw her this happy?" Edward didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on his daughter, who was now showing Thor the flowers in the garden, explaining the name of each one with enthusiasm. And then something broke inside him. That hardness of a businessman used to controlling everything softened. He was a father before he was anything else, and as a father, he wanted to see his daughter happy. "All right, but any sign of trouble, anything, and he's gone." Rebecca agreed, knowing there would be no trouble. She trusted her instincts, and her instincts told her that Thor was exactly what Clara needed. And maybe, in some mysterious way, Clara was exactly what Thor needed too. The first few days were a period of adjustment. Thor explored the house carefully, his military eyes assessing every corner, every exit, every possible threat. He ate little, slept even less. He spent the nights awake, sitting in the living room, watching the darkness through the large windows. Rebecca found him there every morning, still as a statue. It was as if he were still on duty, as if he couldn't turn off the part of him that had been trained to protect and watch. Clara was the only one who could get him to relax. When the girl came home from school, Thor would get up, his tail wagging slightly, and follow her all over the house. He would lie beside her while she did her homework. He would follow her every step when she played in the garden. And at night, against all the rules Edward had set, Thor slept in Clara's room, lying beside her bed, a silent guardian protecting the only person who had shown him kindness in a very long time. Meanwhile, the video of the purchase had spread across social media. What started as a local post quickly went viral. People were moved by the story, a rich girl buying a discarded dog for a single coin. There was something poetic about it, something that touched people on a deep level. Local journalists began to seek out the family. Columnists for news websites wanted interviews. The story was growing beyond their control. Edward was furious with the exposure. He had always carefully protected his family's privacy. But there was no stopping it. The story had a life of its own now, and the more he tried to suppress it, the more interested people became. Who was this family? Why had such a young child done this? What was so special about this dog? Rebecca handled the calls and messages with professional patience, politely declining all interviews. But she knew she couldn't control the narrative forever. Sooner or later, the truth about who they were would come out, and when it did, things could get complicated. But for now, in those first quiet days, everything seemed to be falling into place. Clara went to school more cheerfully. Thor was gaining weight, and his coat was beginning to regain its shine. Edward, though still reluctant, was starting to accept the dog's presence. And Rebecca watched it all with a mix of hope and apprehension. Because she knew life. And she knew that moments of peace usually preceded storms, and the storm was coming. She just didn't know from where yet. Chapter 2. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to the Sterling household. Thor had become part of the routine, his large, silent presence filling spaces they didn't even know existed. Every morning, he would wake before everyone else, positioning himself strategically in the living room from where he could watch all the entrances to the house. It was a habit Rebecca recognized well. Working dogs never fully switched off, even in retirement, even at peace. That vigilance remained etched in their instincts. Clara, on the other hand, blossomed in ways that surprised even her parents. The girl had always been kind and sensitive, but now there was a new confidence in her step. She woke up earlier to spend time with Thor before school, talking to him about her dreams, her fears, her hopes. And Thor listened. He always listened. His attentive eyes followed her every word, every gesture, as if he were storing it all away somewhere deep in his memory. Edward watched this relationship with mixed feelings. As a businessman accustomed to controlling variables and predicting outcomes, he felt uneasy with something as unpredictable as the connection between his daughter and this dog. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the positive impact. Clara was happier, more centered, and for a father, seeing his daughter's happiness was worth more than any logical concern. However, not everything was tranquil. The story that had started as a local viral video was now spreading throughout the state. News websites had published articles, social media influencers commented on the case, and inevitably someone discovered the family's full identity, the Sterling name, the connection to the hotel chain, Rebecca's position as a detective. It all came to light like an unstoppable wave. The first sign that things were changing came one August morning. Edward arrived home from work with a tense face, tossing a magazine onto the kitchen table. Rebecca picked it up and felt her stomach clench. The cover showed a photo of Clara leaving school, taken without permission, with the headline, "The Hotel Heiress and the Dog of Secrets." Inside, a speculative article about the family, their fortune, and questions about why such a wealthy family had gone to an auction for discarded animals. "This is getting out of control," Edward said, his voice controlled but tense. "They're speculating, asking questions. Some of my clients have already called me about the story. This isn't good for business. It isn't good for Clara." Rebecca flipped through the magazine, her police experience analyzing every word, every insinuation. There was something in it that bothered her. It wasn't just journalistic curiosity. There was a darker tone, questions about Thor's past, suggestions that there was more to the story than met the eye, as if someone were looking for something specific. "We need to be careful," she said finally. "This attention isn't normal. Not for a story about adopting an animal. There's something else going on here." Edward sat down heavily, running his hands over his face. "Do you think it has to do with his work? With what he did before?" Rebecca nodded slowly. Retired police canines don't usually end up at auctions. They're typically rehomed, adopted by their own handlers, or as a last resort, taken to specialized shelters. The fact that Thor ended up in that place, being sold for $1 without ceremony or care, it doesn't make sense. Unless someone wanted him to disappear. The silence that followed was heavy. Edward looked at the dog sleeping near the fireplace, its paws twitching slightly in some distant dream. "You're saying our daughter might have brought home more than just an abandoned dog?" Rebecca didn't answer immediately. She knew her words carried weight. She knew she was turning a story of kindness into something potentially dangerous, but her investigator's instincts, honed by years of work, were screaming that something was wrong. "I'm saying we need to be vigilant, and that maybe we should look for more information about his past." That night, after Clara had gone to sleep, Rebecca opened her laptop and began to investigate. She used her contacts in the force, accessed databases, searched for records. What she found was frustrating. Thor's file was incomplete. There were records of his initial training, old photos of him alongside officers during ceremonies, mentions in reports of successful operations. But then, abruptly, it all stopped. 2 years ago, all official records about him simply vanished. There was no retirement report, no medical documentation explaining why he had been removed from service. Just a laconic file note that said, "Reassigned for civilian adoption." This was wrong, completely wrong. Rebecca knew the procedures. Working dogs had detailed histories, especially those injured in the line of duty. There should have been medical reports, behavioral assessments, psychological evaluations. The absence of all this could only mean one thing: someone had deliberately erased it. She closed the laptop, feeling a chill run down her spine. What had Thor seen? What did he know? And more importantly, who was interested in keeping him silenced? The following days passed in a state of growing tension. Edward increased the house's security, installing additional cameras and hiring a night watchman. Rebecca began to vary the routes she used to take Clara to school. And Thor, as if sensing the change in the air, intensified his vigilance. He started making nightly patrols of the house, checking windows, doors, every possible point of entry. It was impossible not to notice. He was in full protection mode. Clara sensed that something was different. The adults spoke in low voices. They stopped talking when she entered the room. There was a tension she didn't fully understand, but she felt it. And like all sensitive children, she reacted in the only way she knew how, by staying closer to Thor. The dog became not just her companion, but her refuge. When the world of adults became too complicated, she would sit with him in the garden and talk about simple things. Flowers, birds, stories she made up. And Thor would stay there, still as a rock, offering the only thing he could, his constant presence. The storm finally broke on a night of intense rain. Aspen Creek was known for its winter storms, but this one had something sinister about it. The wind howled through the pines, rain lashed violently against the windows, and thunder shook the house's foundation. Everyone had gone, to bed early, exhausted by the tension of the past few days. Thor was at his usual post, lying in the hallway between Clara's room and the main staircase. His eyes were closed, but his ears remained erect, catching every sound. And that's why he heard it. A sound that shouldn't have been there. A subtle click. Metal against wood. A window being forced. The dog rose in a fluid motion, all his military training instantly returning. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just moved with silent purpose toward the source of the sound. It was a back window, one that opened onto the side garden, hidden from the cameras by a dense patch of vegetation. Through the rain-streaked glass, Thor could see two silhouettes, men dressed in dark clothing. One was working on the lock while the other kept watch. Thor didn't hesitate. His instincts, trained by years of service, knew exactly what to do. He ran back to the hallway and began to bark. It wasn't an ordinary bark. It was the alert bark that police K9s use to call for backup. Loud, continuous, impossible to ignore. The lights in the house came on almost instantly. Edward was the first one out of his room, followed by Rebecca, who was already grabbing her phone to call the police. Clara appeared at her bedroom door, frightened, and Thor immediately positioned himself between her and the stairs, his body serving as a barrier. The men outside heard the barking and the movement. There was a quick, muffled discussion. One of them insisted on continuing. The other wanted to leave. But the decision was made for them when the window they were forcing finally gave way and swung open. The shorter man entered first, landing on the pantry floor with a thud. The second followed. But they weren't expecting what they found. Thor came down the stairs like a bolt of lightning, his speed surprising for a dog of his size. The first intruder didn't even have time to react before he was taken down. Thor seized him by the sleeve of his jacket, using his weight and strength to pin him to the floor. He didn't bite. He didn't injure. He just contained, exactly as he had been trained to do. The second man tried to run, but Edward was already coming down the stairs with a baseball bat. The confrontation was brief. The intruder, realizing he was trapped between an angry man and a combat dog, simply surrendered, raising his hands. The police sirens could already be heard in the distance as Rebecca came down, still on the phone with dispatch. She assessed the scene with professional eyes. Thor held the first intruder completely immobilized, without using excessive violence, but with total control. Edward held the second one against the wall, and Clara was safe upstairs. When the police arrived, they found an organized scene. The intruders were contained. No one was hurt. And Thor finally released his hold when Rebecca gave the command, backing away but remaining alert. The officers who entered immediately recognized the dog's behavior. "That's police training," one of them commented. "Where did you get him?" The question went unanswered as they began to search the intruders. And that's when things got even stranger. The man Thor had pinned was carrying something unusual. Not standard burglary tools, not weapons. It was a small laptop and, more intriguingly, a piece of paper with notes on it. Numbers, codes, and in the middle of the notes something that made Rebecca freeze. An alphanumeric sequence that looked strangely familiar. She looked at Thor. The dog had returned to Clara's side, who had come downstairs and was now clinging to him, crying with fear and relief. And then Rebecca saw it. The old collar Thor still wore, the one that had come with him from the auction. There were numbers engraved on it, numbers that corresponded exactly with part of the notes found on the intruder. The men were taken to the station. Rebecca went with them, leaving Edward at home with Clara and reinforced security. During the interrogation, the intruders refused to talk, demanding lawyers. But the police found more evidence, records of deleted messages, connections to persons of interest. And the more they investigated, the clearer it became that this had not been an ordinary burglary. These men were looking for something specific, and that something had to do with Thor. Back at home in the early hours of the morning, Rebecca sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Thor was lying at her feet, finally relaxed after the night's adrenaline. She watched the dog, her mind working through the connections, the numbers on the collar, the intruders, notes, the erased file. It all pointed to the same conclusion. Thor wasn't just a retired dog. He was living evidence of something. Edward appeared in the doorway, equally unable to sleep. "We need to see what's in that collar," he said simply. Rebecca agreed. Carefully, she called Thor, who lifted his head. The dog watched as she gently removed the old collar from his neck, replacing it with a new one they had bought weeks ago. Thor didn't resist. It was as if he trusted her completely. The collar was made of old leather, worn by time and use. Rebecca examined it carefully under the kitchen light. The numbers engraved on the outside were visible but faded, But there was something else, a small irregularity in the inner stitching. She took a pair of scissors and, with surgical precision, began to cut the stitches. Inside, hidden between the layers of leather and fabric, was a small object wrapped in electrical tape. A USB drive. Tiny. Protected. Hidden so well that years of wearing the collar had not revealed its presence. Edward and Rebecca looked at each other. "This changes everything," he said in a low voice. Rebecca nodded, holding the small device as if it were a bomb about to explode. And maybe it was, because whoever hides information like this in such an unlikely place is usually protecting something dangerous, something people would kill to keep hidden. "We can't open this here," she said finally. "It needs to be done securely, with witnesses, with legal protection." Edward agreed. "And Thor?" He looked at the dog, who was watching them calmly. Rebecca ran a hand through the animal's fur. "He stays with us, always. He's part of the family now, and we're going to protect him just like he protected us." The sun was beginning to rise when Clara finally came downstairs, still in her pajamas, looking for Thor. The dog immediately went to her, touching his muzzle to her hand in a comforting gesture. The girl wrapped her arms around his neck, whispering things that only the two of them understood. And in that moment, despite all the tension and danger, Rebecca felt something calm in her heart. Because regardless of what that USB drive contained, regardless of the storms yet to come, they were together. And Thor, the dog everyone had discarded, had proven to be more valuable than anyone could have ever imagined. In the following weeks, the case grew to enormous proportions. The police analyzed the USB drive under strict security protocols, and what they found shocked even the most experienced investigators. Confidential files, audio recordings, documents dating back 2 years, evidence of compromised operations, internal complaints that had been filed away without investigation, and at the center of it all, the name of the officer who had been Thor's partner, Captain Marcus Vance. The captain had been killed under suspicious circumstances 2 years prior, officially described as an accident during an operation, but the files on the USB drive told a different story. They showed that he had discovered a corruption scheme within his own department, that he had collected evidence, and that he had hidden that evidence in the one place no one would think to look, in the collar of his K9 partner. Thor had been a silent witness to it all. He was there when his partner was betrayed. He was there when they tried to silence the truth. And his forced retirement hadn't just been the disposal of an injured animal. It had been an attempt to erase evidence, to eliminate the last connection to that inconvenient investigation. The revelation exploded in the national media. The names of political figures and high-ranking police officials were exposed. Investigations were opened. Arrests were made. And at the center of it all was the unlikely story of a 6-year-old girl who had bought a dog for $1 and, without knowing it, had unearthed one of the biggest corruption scandals the state had seen in decades. The Sterling home became a media circus. Journalists camped outside. Cameras followed their every move. Edward had to hire additional private security just to allow Clara to go to school. And Rebecca, suddenly at the center of a massive investigation, had to balance her role as a mother and as a police officer involved in the case. But through it all, Thor remained constant. He didn't understand spotlights or headlines. He didn't comprehend the magnitude of what his simple existence had revealed. For him, there was only one thing that mattered: the girl who had chosen him when no one else would. The child who had seen him not as a problem or a tool, but as a being worthy of love. Clara, for her part, dealt with the attention in the only way a child could, by ignoring what she didn't understand and focusing on what mattered. She still played with Thor in the garden. She still talked to him about her days at school. She still slept better knowing he was there, protecting her dreams. One afternoon, weeks after the invasion, Rebecca found Clara sitting in the garden with Thor, showing him the coin she had used to buy him. The girl had drilled a hole in it and turned it into a pendant she wore on a cord around her neck. "Look, Thor," she was saying. "This is the magic coin, the one that brought you into my life. Do you think it can do more magic?" Rebecca watched the scene with tears in her eyes, because the real magic wasn't in the coin. It was in the purity of a child who had seen value where adults only saw waste. It was in the loyalty of an animal that had kept a secret for years, waiting for the right moment. It was in the courage to do what was right, even when the path was uncertain. And as the sun set over, the mountains of Aspen Creek, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, that unlikely family remained together. United not just by circumstance, but by something deeper. Something that couldn't be bought or sold. Something that was worth infinitely more than any fortune. Love, loyalty, and the unshakable belief that even in the most unlikely of places, we can find exactly what we need, if only we have the courage to look with our hearts. Chapter 3. The months that followed the revelation of the scandal transformed not only the life of the Sterling family, but the entire power structure that had remained hidden for so long. The investigation spread like ripples in a calm lake, reaching ever farther, touching people and institutions that believed they were protected by time and silence. And at the center of it all, involuntarily, was the unlikely story of a girl, a dog, and a coin. Rebecca found herself immersed in a world she knew well, but never so personally. As a career detective, she had participated in complex investigations, had seen corruption and injustice, but always from a professional distance. Now every development in the case directly affected her family. Every arrest made, every revelation disclosed, every approaching trial. It all brought consequences to her home, her daughter, and the dog that had become an inseparable part of their lives. Edward handled the situation in his own way. As a businessman, he understood crisis and reputation management, but this was different. This wasn't about numbers or market strategies. It was about protecting his family in the midst of a storm that seemed to have no end. He hired lawyers, he reinforced security, he changed routines. But none of it could completely shield them from the weight of constant attention, the stares on the street, the whispered comments. Clara, in her childlike innocence, didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened. To her, Thor had stopped bad men from getting into the house. That was heroic and simple. The rest, all the complexity of police corruption and political schemes, was too abstract for her 6-year-old mind. And perhaps that was for the best, because while the adults around her navigated turbulent waters, she remained anchored in the only truth that mattered. She loved Thor, and Thor protected her. School became an unexpected challenge. Previously discreet about her family background, Clara was now recognized by everyone. Classmates treated her differently, some with invasive curiosity, others with poorly disguised envy, and there were those, few but memorable, who avoided her completely, their families instructing them to keep their distance from the girl who had caused such an uproar. Clara felt the change without fully understanding its causes, and it hurt her in ways she didn't know how to express. Thor noticed. Animals have a sensitivity to human emotions that transcends words. He noticed when Clara came home from school quieter than usual. He noticed when she hid in the garden, crying softly where she thought no one could see her. And in those moments he would simply be there. He didn't try to cheer her up or distract her. He just offered his constant presence, his large body serving as a shield against a world that suddenly seemed too big and confusing. One afternoon, Rebecca found the two of them in the garden. Clara was lying on the grass, hugging Thor, telling him about a classmate who had said she was only being nice because she wanted to be on TV. "Thor, do you think I did something wrong?" the girl asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Why are people being mean to me?" Rebecca felt her heart ache. She approached slowly and sat on the grass beside them. Clara looked up at her with tear-filled eyes. "I just wanted to help him, Mommy. I didn't know it would cause all these problems." And there, in that simple but profound moment, Rebecca took her daughter in her arms and explained with carefully chosen words. "You didn't cause any problems, my love. You did something beautiful, something brave. What happened after, everything that came to light, that's not your fault. Those bad things already existed long before you were born. You just turned on a light that showed where they were hiding. And yes, some people will be uncomfortable with that light, but that doesn't make the light a bad thing." Clara absorbed the words slowly, her young mind processing concepts too complex for her age. "And Thor," she asked, "will he have to go away because of all this?" The question revealed the real fear that tormented her, the fear that somehow all this turmoil would result in losing the one being who understood her completely. Rebecca looked at the dog, who was watching the conversation with his attentive, intelligent eyes. "Never," she said firmly. "Thor is part of our family now. Nothing will change that. No matter what happens, he stays with us. Always." Thor tilted his head, and Rebecca could have sworn she saw something like understanding in his gaze, and gratitude, because he too had had fears, fears of being returned, of being considered too much trouble, of being once again discarded. But there, in that garden, with that strong woman and that pure child, he finally understood what it was to have a real home. Meanwhile, the consequences of the scandal continued to unfold. The trial of those involved was approaching. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and the story of how it all came to light through a USB drive hidden in a dog's collar became part of local folklore. People talked about it in cafes and markets. Teachers used it as an example in lessons on ethics and courage, and slowly, very slowly, the narrative began to change. It was no longer about the rich family who had bought a dog out of curiosity. It was about a child who had seen value where adults saw waste. It was about loyalty. That transcended species. It was about how the smallest actions, done with a pure heart, can trigger immeasurable change. And this shift in narrative brought something unexpected. Support. People began sending letters to the family, messages of gratitude for bringing the truth to light, stories of others who had adopted discarded animals and found faithful companions, donations to animal welfare organizations. The movement grew organically, fueled not by marketing or propaganda, but by genuine emotional connection. It was amidst this movement that Rebecca had an idea that at first seemed too ambitious, but the more she thought about it, the more sense it made. She shared it first with Edward, one night after Clara had gone to sleep. "What if we bought that property?" she said. "The barn where the auction happened. What if we turned it into something different? Something that honors not just Thor, but all the working animals who are discarded when they're no longer useful?" Edward was silent for a long moment, processing the proposal. It was a big investment. It was work. It was a long-term commitment. But as he considered it, his eyes went to the window where he could see Thor, lying in the hallway near Clara's room, ever vigilant. And he thought of his daughter, who had shown them both what it meant to act with compassion without expecting anything in return. "Let's do it," he said finally. "But we do it right. Not just a shelter. A complete rehabilitation center, vets, trainers, animal psychologists, a place where these animals can be treated with the dignity they deserve." The decision, once made, unfolded quickly. Edward, with his business expertise, structured the project. Rebecca, with her contacts in the police force, established partnerships, and together they began to build something that would be more than just a shelter. It would be a sanctuary, a recognition that those who serve, whether on 2 legs or 4, deserve to be honored, not forgotten. The land was acquired, the plans were developed, and when they finally shared the idea with Clara, explaining that they were going to turn that sad place where they found Thor into a home for others like him, the girl reacted in a way neither parent expected. She asked if she could help, not just by visiting or playing with the animals, but by really helping, reading stories to the scared dogs, sitting with those who didn't trust humans, showing them that not all people were bad, and so the Thor Institute was born, named not because Thor was special in any technical sense, but because he represented something fundamental. The idea that every discarded being deserves a second chance. That value is not measured by immediate utility, but by essence, and that sometimes the most broken are the most resilient. The construction took months. The old barn was completely renovated. Where there were once rusty bars and makeshift pens, there were now spacious, clean enclosures. Rehabilitation areas equipped with state-of-the-art veterinary technology, gardens designed to allow injured animals to move safely, and at the center of it all, a statue, not large or ostentatious, but significant. A bronze child, kneeling, reaching out a hand to a dog, and on the base, a simple inscription: for those who serve, for those who love, for those who choose to see value where others see only cost. The inauguration was scheduled for a Saturday in May. Guests arrived from all over the state: former police officers, veterinarians, animal welfare activists, journalists, but also ordinary people, those who had been touched by the story and wanted to be part of that moment. The atmosphere was one of celebration, but also of reverence, because everyone understood that this was more than just a new building. It was a paradigm shift. Clara, wearing a simple dress she had chosen herself, was visibly nervous. She would have to speak. Her parents had gently suggested that it would be meaningful if she said a few words. But the girl, despite her courage in many areas, was terrified of public speaking. Thor sensed her anxiety. He stayed by her side throughout the ceremony, his large body offering tactile comfort. And when it was time for Clara to approach the microphone, he went with her, drawing smiles from the audience. Clara held the microphone with trembling hands and looked out at the sea of faces before her. For a moment, it seemed she would give up. But then her eyes found Thor. The dog was watching her with that unshakable calm that had become his trademark, and the girl took a deep breath. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice small but clear, "that Thor taught me something important. He taught me that everyone deserves to be loved. It doesn't matter if they're broken. It doesn't matter if people say they're not useful anymore. Everyone deserves someone to look at them and say, 'You matter.'" The silence that followed was absolute. And then, starting slowly but quickly growing, applause filled the air. It wasn't polite, ceremonial applause. It was genuine, emotional applause, because those simple words, spoken by a child, captured something that many adults spend their entire lives trying to articulate. In the months that followed, the Thor Institute established itself not just as a shelter, but as a model. Other states began to visit, studying, their methods adapting their ideas. Legislators cited the Institute when proposing new animal protection laws, and slowly, very slowly, things began to change. Retired working dogs started to have more dignified exit protocols. Adoption programs were established. Medical histories were properly preserved. Clara continued to visit the Institute regularly. She had her favorite charges: a shepherd who had lost a leg and was now learning to walk with a prosthetic, a search and rescue dog that had developed severe anxiety after a traumatic operation, an explosives detection dog that had gone deaf but whose sense of smell remained sharp. Each one had a story. Each one had value. And Clara knew all their stories by heart. Thor, curiously, didn't interact much with the other animals at the Institute. He remained focused on Clara, always. But there were moments, when the girl was busy helping, that he would sit near the other dogs. He didn't touch. He didn't play. He just remained there, a solid, comforting presence. And the other dogs, especially the newly arrived and still frightened ones, seemed to calm in his presence, as if they recognized in him an equal, someone who had survived, someone who had found their way back. Rebecca watched these interactions with professional fascination and maternal emotion. She had seen many working dogs throughout her career, had worked with several. But Thor was different. There was a consciousness in him, an understanding that went beyond training. She couldn't explain it scientifically, but she felt that he understood. He understood what the Institute meant. He understood that his own journey, from discard to redemption, was now the map for others to follow. Edward, pragmatic as ever, focused on the practical aspects. He ensured the Institute ran efficiently, that there were sufficient funds, that the staff was well trained and compensated. But even he, who had always prided himself on his business objectivity, couldn't deny the emotional impact. Seeing animals that arrived broken, scared, hopeless, slowly transform into confident beings again, it touched something deep within him. There was one particular case that marked him, a police canine whose partner had been killed in the line of duty. The animal had developed severe depression, refusing food, avoiding contact. He was brought to the Institute as a last resort. Everyone expected it to be a lost cause. But Clara, with her gentle stubbornness, sat with him daily. She didn't force interaction. She just sat there reading books aloud, telling stories. And Thor, in his moments of silent supervision, would also stay close. It took weeks, but slowly the dog began to respond. First, just by moving his head when Clara spoke, then accepting food from her hand, eventually allowing her to touch him. And finally, one memorable day, he laid his head in her lap and closed his eyes, relaxing for the first time since losing his partner. Edward witnessed that moment and had to leave the room, not because he was ashamed to show emotion, but because in that moment, he finally understood completely what his daughter had seen from the beginning, that healing doesn't come from protocols or medication alone. It comes from connection, from patience, from unconditional love. As the Institute grew, so did the story of its origin. Documentarians asked for permission to film. Writers wanted to turn it into a book. There was even interest from Hollywood in adapting it for a film. Edward and Rebecca refused everything, not because they didn't see value in sharing the story, but because they knew that any commercialization would strip the purity from what had happened. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about doing what was right, simply because it was right. But they did allow one thing. A local journalist, who had followed the story from the beginning with sensitivity and respect, was given permission to write a series of articles, not sensationalist, not exploitative, but human, telling the stories of the animals that passed through the Institute, the people who helped them, the small daily victories that constituted the real work of rehabilitation. And these articles, published weekly, became required reading in the region, constant reminders that compassion is active work, not a passive feeling. Clara grew up in the midst of all this. Her initial innocence matured into a deeper understanding. She saw now that the world was not simple, that there were nuances and complexities, that not everyone would agree with her choices. But she also learned something fundamental, that acting with kindness, even when it was difficult, even when misunderstood, was always the right choice. Thor was her living proof of that, and the dog, now older, greyer in the muzzle, remained as he always had, vigilant, protective, loyal. He had gained weight since the auction days. His coat had regained its shine. The scars remained, but they no longer defined who he was. He was no longer the discarded dog. He was no longer the silent evidence of forgotten crimes. He was Thor, Clara's companion, guardian of the Sterling family, a symbol of hope for countless others. One night when Clara was 7, almost a year after the Institute's inauguration, she sat with Thor in the garden under the stars. The coin-turned pendant swung from her neck. Thor lay beside her, his breathing calm and regular. "You know, Thor," she said thoughtfully, "my teacher said today that sometimes the most important things start with the simplest gestures. I think she was talking about us, about that coin, about that day in the barn." Thor didn't answer, obviously, but his tail thumped gently on the ground, and Clara smiled, hugging his neck. "I'm glad I chose you, or that you chose me. I'm not sure how it works, but I'm glad we're together, and I hope we stay this way forever." Inside the house, Rebecca watched from the window. Edward came up behind her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "She did something remarkable, you know," he said softly. "Our daughter, she's changed more lives than we can count, all because she saw a dog no one else wanted and decided he mattered." Rebecca nodded, silent tears running down her face. "And you know what's most incredible? She didn't do it expecting recognition. She didn't do it expecting any of this to come from it. She did it because it was the right thing to do, because her heart told her to. That's purity, Edward. That's what the world needs more of." They stood there, watching their daughter and the dog under the stars, and felt something rare and precious, deep gratitude, not just for their fortunate circumstances, but for the opportunity to witness genuine goodness, to see that even in a world that is often cynical and harsh, compassion still had power. It still changed things. It still mattered. And as the night wrapped Aspen Creek in its cold mountain embrace, that family, united by love and forged in adversity, knew that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together. Because they had learned the most important lesson, that family is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by choice, by loyalty, by being there when it counts. And Thor, that silent warrior with a heart of gold, had finally found what everyone searches for: a place to call home, and people to call family. Chapter 4. 3 years had passed since that cold morning at the Aspen Creek auction. 3 years that felt simultaneously like an eternity and the blink of an eye. Clara was now 9 years old, and while she still possessed the sweetness that defined her, there was a maturity about her that surprised even those who knew her well. It was the maturity of someone who had seen the world reveal its complexities earlier than she should have, yet still chose to believe in good. Thor was older. His movements had the characteristic slowness of large breed dogs entering their golden years. His muzzle was almost completely grey. His legs were a little stiffer when he got up. But his eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes, remained as alert as ever. He still made his nightly rounds of the house. He still positioned himself strategically where he could watch all the entrances. He was still the silent guardian he had always been, just a little slower, a little more tired. The Thor Institute had established itself as a national benchmark in the rehabilitation of working animals. More than 200 dogs had already passed through its facilities. Some stayed permanently, unable to adapt to ordinary life after years of intense service. Others were gradually rehabilitated and rehomed with carefully selected families, and there were those, few but memorable, who found new purposes, working in schools as therapy dogs or in hospitals bringing comfort to patients. The staff had grown to include specialized veterinarians, behavioral trainers, and even a consulting animal psychologist. But at the heart of it all remained the simple truth that Clara had demonstrated on that first day, that every being deserves to be seen, truly seen, not for what they failed to be, but for what they could still become. Clara visited the Institute every week. It was as much a part of her routine as school or family meals. She had her special charges, animals that arrived particularly traumatized and with whom she would spend hours simply being present. She didn't force interaction. She didn't impose affection. She just offered a constant presence and slowly, patiently, allowed trust to be rebuilt. Her mother watched these sessions with growing admiration. Rebecca had seen professional therapists work with traumatized animals. She had studied techniques and methodologies, but there was something about Clara that transcended training. It was pure intuition, natural empathy. The girl simply knew when to approach and when to give space, when to speak and when to remain silent, as if she and the animals shared a language that needed no words. Edward had changed too. The pragmatic businessman who initially saw the Institute as a social responsibility project now treated it with personal passion. He spent as much time there as he did at his hotels. He knew every animal, by name. He understood their stories, and he could often be found sitting in some quiet corner just watching, allowing these beings who had given so much to society to simply exist in peace. But that spring, change was in the air. Thor began to show signs that worried everyone. Nothing dramatic, just small indications that time was taking its toll. He slept more. He got up with more difficulty, and although he still followed Clara everywhere, there were moments when he simply didn't have the energy to keep up with her. Clara noticed but didn't speak of it. It was as if she were afraid that giving voice to her concern would make it real, so she just adjusted. She walked more slowly when Thor followed her. She chose calmer activities, and at night she would lie on the floor beside him, hugging his large body, whispering words of love and gratitude. Rebecca and Edward discussed the situation in low voices when Clara was at school. They knew this moment would come. Dogs, especially large breeds, especially those who had lived lives as intense as Thor's, didn't last forever. The Institute's veterinarian had been clear. Thor was aging naturally. There was no specific disease, just wear and tear. The body that had served so faithfully was simply tired. The most difficult conversation came one Saturday afternoon. Clara was in the garden with Thor, and her parents joined her. The girl looked at them and immediately knew. There was something in their expressions, in the way they sat down, in the heavy silence that preceded their words. She hugged Thor tighter. "He's going to be okay," she said, but her voice trembled. "He just needs to rest more, that's all." Rebecca took her daughter's hand. "My love, we need to talk about Thor, about how he's feeling." Clara shook her head vigorously. "No, he's fine. He'll get better. He has to get better. But tears were already beginning to stream down her face, because even at 9 she understood. She knew what this conversation meant. Edward took a deep breath, fighting his own emotions. "Honey, Thor gave so much to us. He protected us. He loved you in a way few can love. And now he's tired. His body is asking for rest. And part of loving someone is recognizing when they need true rest, when holding on is more about us than about them." The words hit Clara with physical force. She buried her face in Thor's fur, her sobs shaking her small shoulders. "But I'm not ready. I don't want to let him go. I can't. Thor is my best friend. He's always been here. Always. And now you're telling me he's going to leave me." Thor turned his head and gently licked the tears from Clara's face. His movements were tired but deliberate, and in that simple gesture there was a profound communication. It was okay. He was at peace, and she would be okay too eventually. Rebecca hugged her daughter. "No one is saying it's right now. It's not an immediate decision. But we want you to be prepared, to enjoy every moment with him, to say everything you need to say. Because when the time comes, we want you to have no regrets, only beautiful memories." The days that followed were precious in a bittersweet way. Clara spent every free minute with Thor. She would take her blanket to the garden and lie with him in the sun, reading their favorite books aloud. She told him stories about the future she had imagined, where Thor would live forever and be with her until she grew up. And Thor would listen, his eyes closing occasionally, not from sleep, but from deep contentment. The Institute felt the change too. The entire staff knew Thor. He was, in many ways, the spirit that animated the whole place. His silent presence had comforted countless frightened animals. His story had inspired the creation of this sanctuary. And now, to see him decline was like watching an era come to an end. But something beautiful emerged from the sadness. People began to share their own stories. Staff members talked about how Thor had inspired them to change careers. Visitors wrote letters telling how his story had motivated adoptions. Families sent photos of animals they had saved, crediting their decision to the courage Clara and Thor had shown. Clara read every letter, every story, and slowly through the grief she began to understand something. Thor's impact wasn't just in the time he had lived, but in the legacy he would leave behind. He had changed lives, saved lives, not just by stopping the home invasion, but by the example he had set, of resilience, of loyalty, of unconditional love. A week after that difficult conversation, Clara woke in the middle of the night with a strange feeling. She went downstairs and found Thor in the living room, in his usual watch position, but something was different. He was panting more than usual. His body was trembling slightly. And when she called his name, he turned his head but didn't get up. Clara ran to her parents' room. Her frightened cries woke them instantly. Rebecca called the Institute's veterinarian, while Edward carefully carried Thor to the car. The drive to the Institute was tense. Clara held Thor's head in her lap, whispering words of encouragement. "You can do it. You're strong. You've always been so strong." At the Institute, the veterinarian, Dr. Miles, a kind man who had dedicated his life to animals, examined Thor with reverent care. When he finished, his face was serious but gentle. He took the family into a private room. Thor was lying on a comfortable mattress with Clara beside him, refusing to let go. The vet knelt to be on their level. "His heart is very tired. We can give him medication to keep him with us a little longer. But it would be time filled with discomfort for him. No quality, just prolonging it. Or we can let him go in peace, without pain, surrounded by those who love him." The silence that followed was the heaviest that family had ever experienced. Clara hugged Thor tighter, her entire body shaking with sobs. "It's not fair. He deserves more time. He deserves to be happy." Edward knelt beside his daughter, tears streaming down his own face. "He was happy, honey. He's been happy since the day you chose him. And now he needs to rest. And we, because we love him, need to be strong enough to let him." Rebecca was on the opposite side of Thor, her hand stroking his head. She had seen many things in her career. She had witnessed tragedies and triumphs. But seeing this noble animal reach the end of his journey, broke her heart in ways nothing had before. Clara looked into Thor's eyes. The dog looked back at her, and in that gaze was something the girl recognized: peace. He wasn't scared. He wasn't fighting. He was ready, and seeing him like that, so tranquil, gave Clara the strength she needed. "It's okay, Thor," she whispered, her voice broken, but firm. "You can rest now. You did everything you needed to do. You taught me everything I needed to learn. And I'm going to be okay. I promise. I'll take care of the Institute. I'll take care of the others like you took care of me, and I will remember you every single day, forever." Thor closed his eyes, his body relaxed, and with Dr. Miles gently administering the medication that would take him without pain, surrounded by the family that loved him, Thor passed away. It was not dramatic, it was not traumatic, it was peaceful, dignified, exactly how he had lived. Clara remained there for a long time, hugging the still warm body of her best friend, unable to fully process that he was gone. Her parents respected that time. They let her have those final moments, knowing they were important, knowing that grief needs space to begin. When they finally got up, it was already dawn. The Institute staff had arrived, having been informed. No one said much. They just offered their silent presence, a shared respect. Thor was prepared with reverent care. He would be buried in the Institute's gardens, under an old tree overlooking the mountains he had watched over for so long. The funeral took place on a morning of soft sunshine. More people attended than the family had expected. Police officers from all over the state, veterinarians, trainers, families who had adopted animals from the Institute. Everyone wanted to pay their respects to the dog who had changed so much. Clara, wearing her favorite dress and with the coin still hanging around her neck, stood by the grave, holding her parents' hands. She had prepared words, but when the moment came, she found they were unnecessary. Instead, she simply told a story. The Fima, story of a cold morning, a sad barn, and an unlikely connection. She told of how Thor had taught her that value isn't measured by utility, that loyalty transcends circumstances, that love, true love, is a daily choice to be present, and that sometimes the most broken have the most important lessons to teach. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye, and as Thor's body was gently laid to rest, Clara took the coin from her neck and placed it in the earth beside him. "This is the magic coin," she said softly, "the one that brought us together. Now it stays with you, so you'll always remember that you were loved, completely, unconditionally." The months that followed were difficult. The house felt empty without Thor's large, silent presence. Clara went through moments where she would forget he was gone, turning to share something and finding only empty space. The nights were particularly hard. Her room felt too big without the sound of Thor's heavy breathing beside her bed. But slowly, with the support of her family and her work at the Institute, Clara began to process the loss. She channeled her grief into purpose. She spent even more time at the Institute, working with the animals that needed it most. And she discovered something, that by helping others, she honored Thor's memory. Every animal she helped rehabilitate was a living tribute to the dog who had taught her to see value where others saw only cost. Thor's story continued to spread. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and the Thor Institute became not just a place, but a movement. Similar institutes began to spring up in other states, all inspired by the example that had been set. Legislation was changed to better protect retired working animals, and slowly, culturally, the conversation about how we treat those who serve began to shift. Clara grew with this legacy. She knew she had a responsibility, not just to the Institute, but to the idea it represented. And though still young, she was beginning to understand the weight and privilege of that responsibility. It was she who now told Thor's story to visitors. It was she who explained the Institute's philosophy to new employees. It was she who carried forward the message that a silent dog and a simple coin had begun. Years later, when Clara was 15, she was giving a speech at a national animal welfare convention. The auditorium was full. Hundreds of people had come to hear the young woman who had changed so much, and as she spoke, sharing lessons learned and challenges faced, she realized something profound. That Thor wasn't just her dog. He was a symbol of something bigger, of resilience, of second chances, of the inherent dignity of every living being. She ended her speech the way she always did, with a question for the audience. How many of you have a dollar coin in your pocket right now? Hands went up hesitantly. Look at it, Clara said. That coin of insignificant monetary value can change everything if you choose to use it with intention. It can save a life. It can start a movement. It can honor those who serve. It all depends on how you choose to see value. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Clara didn't do it for applause. She did it because she had a debt. To a dog who had taught her what it meant to love unconditionally, to parents who had supported a stubborn child in her vision of kindness, to countless animals who still needed her voice, and to the memory of a cold auction where it all began. That night back in Aspen Creek, Clara visited Thor's grave under the old tree. The simple headstone read, Thor, guardian, hero, friend. She sat on the grass, looking at the moonlit mountains. You'd be proud, she said softly. The Institute has helped over 1,000 animals now. There are 10 similar institutes across the country, and a new law protecting working dogs was passed, all because you existed, all because you were loved. The wind blew gently, rustling the leaves of the tree, and Clara smiled, feeling deep in her heart that somehow wherever he was, Thor knew, and he was at peace, just as she finally was too, because she had learned the most important lesson Thor had ever taught, that true love doesn't end with physical absence. It continues, in actions, in choices, in legacies that touch lives beyond what we can imagine, and that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give us is to teach us how to love completely, how to choose kindness even when it's hard, how to see value where others see only cost. Clara stood, gently touching the headstone, one last time. Thank you, Thor, for everything. And she walked back toward home, ready to continue the work, to honor the memory, to be the change the world needed to see. Exactly as a discarded dog and a simple coin had taught her so many years ago on a cold morning in Aspen Creek. And so the story that had begun with sadness and discard ended with hope and purpose, proving that even in the most unlikely of places, with the simplest of gestures, we can change the world, one heart at a time, one life at a time, life at one coin at a time.